Hey folks, welcome back. So today is going to be part two of the whole airsoft ballistics profile and talking about shooting. And today we're going to talk more specifically about the sights and how to use them in an AR platform. But if you remember, last time we talked about was kind of more of an overview. It's a bit lengthy of a video, but we were talking about how depending on how far you are from a target, sometimes the way your shots are landing exactly where you're looking at, and other times they're landing either a bit high or a bit low. And it's not a random pattern. It all has to do with kind of the ballistics of it. And of course the profile that the gun is going to produce. So today we're going to focus on the AR platform, both the kind of the older A1 style sights and system, and some of the newer one like the M4 style ones. So to recap or to review, remember this, we flipped through the owner's manual of this is the Marui one here. If you remember, again, what we're talking about is like that red line right there represents your line of sight, right? It's a straight line, and that's what you're looking at through the two sight posts. But your rounds are at an angle, right? So when you're firing, it's not going to hit exactly where you're looking at until all the way out at a certain range. And we're going to talk about what that range is and how it varies, but it's going to basically, at that point where basically it crosses the line of sight, your round crosses your line of sight, means that where you're looking at is where your round is going to hit. Obviously, if your target was, say, right here, right, you would look at the target, but your rounds would be hitting low because the round hasn't crossed the line of sight yet. Now, this drawing doesn't go further than that, but if you were to go further than that, right, it's a different pattern, and your rounds will be hitting higher than where you're looking at. So that's kind of an overview real quick. So I know that's for the M4 system, but to illustrate that, that's basically this is how it would look like. I kind of drew this car 15 model right here, and to illustrate it, and it's kind of great how I think in reality, oftentimes airsoft tries to replicate the real steel as much as possible, and this is one area that's surprisingly very similar to the real steel. So if in the real steel version, what happens is that when you're zeroing your sights, basically, you're picking a target at around 25 meters, okay? And let's say that this point is right here is 25 meter mark right here. And you adjust your sights, and we'll talk about all this with this platform in a second, how to do this, but you're adjusting your sights so that you hit right where your line of sight is, right? So that's your line of sight, and that's like, I don't know, that's your face right there, I guess. That's your line of sight, and you adjust it there, and your round flies boom, 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 and hits there, right, at 25 meters. And what happens is that when you zero at 25, you're really zeroing at 300 meters. Okay, that's 300 meters right there. Because what happens is that even though it's and remember, this is the same little drawing that you just saw earlier in the manual. That's where the round crosses the line of sight. But again, because this is at a curved angle, it's going to keep, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but to prove a point. But then it kind of curves, and then it eventually, boom, boom, drops right there. So at 300 meters, you basically hit where you were hitting before, right? So if you zero your rifle at 25 meters, you should be able to hit it at 300 meters in theory. The problem with that, of course, is that before we go to that, in the airsoft world, of course, we know that the rounds can't go out to 300 meters. That's just the range is just way too much, right? We can't shoot anywhere near that. So in a similar fashion, in the airsoft world, we'll do it anywhere from 20 to about 25 feet. And basically that puts you on target for anywhere from let me cross these out so we don't look at these anymore. That would put you from anywhere from about 50 to about 75 feet. So basically you zero it at 25 feet, and you'll follow the same flight, this ballistics trajectory, and land your targets at 50 to 75 feet. Now, of course, I know these rounds can go much further than that, but you would have to kind of like tilt tilt the rifle up a little bit, right? So if you were going to have it kind of like in the flat setting like this, right, that would, in its zeroed format, you can hit it at 75. If you need to shoot a target, say at 150 feet, naturally what that means is that you would kind of like elevate, you would lift it up and point it upwards like that, so that it kind of arcs it a little bit further. And the sights can help you with that too. And we'll talk about that. But in a nutshell, that's kind of the principles that we're working with right here. So if we're going to look at the airsoft world, what we're going to happen is let's talk about zeroing real quick with these sights. So I know a lot of folks don't really even use iron sights anymore. It's kind of an outdated thing, I think, for the most part, is what I'm hearing a lot of people are doing, since everyone's using like optics. It's just, you know, but a lot of my collection, they're based on really just the old school stuff, and I don't really use optics. I think they're kind of expensive too. So I'm just more of like a classical vintage kind of person. So we're going to follow the same principle. We're going to try to zero, if we were to zero something at 20 to 25 feet, you can choose either one. The reason I choose 20 to 25 feet is kind of because it's the kind of the lowest distance that you can still reliably hit targets at. And if you make sight adjustments, these sight adjustments, whether it's the rear sight or the front sight, you can actually make actual changes in there. Obviously, if you you zero your sights at say 10 feet, you're not going to be able to do that, because no matter how much you dial these sights in, you're not going to be able to make those dramatic changes. If you zero your sights further out, it might be a little bit more difficult to make this whole system work out, and it's going to change things a little bit. But 20 to 25 feet works pretty well. I use 20 personally. I like 20 because 20 is the longest indoor distance that I have available to me, so that, you know, other factors don't vary or, you know, throw it off a little bit. But I have had to move it out further to 25 or even a little bit further for some other guns. Anyway, so let's say you pick a 20 to 25 feet distance, and so what you want to do, let's talk about quick things about the terminology real quick. So if you'll notice, get some lights here. If you notice right here, this is the front sight post, right? All your ARs are going to have this up sign right here with a little arrow pointing that way. Now that indicates the direction or the point of impact of where your rounds are landing, right? That doesn't indicate whether this little the front sight post is that doesn't indicate the direction of the front sight post. So if I were to press down on that detent pin right there and then turn it, basically, right? Sometimes people use a nail, sometimes you're supposed to use a tip of a bullet to use it, or other people use like a tool that comes with a gun, and you kind of just press down on it and turn it, basically. But that refers to the impact of the round. So if you were to press that detent down and turn it, the front sight post would actually start going down, right? Not up, it's going to go down. So that refers to where your round's going to land. And again, the reason behind that is if the front sight post goes down, right, when you're naturally aiming the rifle, you're going to want to align it with that tip of that sight post, and that's going to cause you to obviously naturally point it up. And if your gun points up, right, you're going to move your rounds upwards. So again, that's what happens there. And then in the rear sight post, in this case, this is the old A1 style sight with the little wheel on the back. And you'll notice that you press the detent down here to turn it. This is a new gun, so it's a little bit older it's still like kind of stiff to move. But if you press that detent down and you turn it to the right, that again refers to the impact of the round. So if you turn it to the right, it's going to move it to the right. But incidentally, because it's the rear sight, it would also move the rear aperture to the right too as well. And if you move it backwards, it's to the left, and it'll also move it to the left. It's just kind of the front sight post that's a little bit weird. So anyway, you find a position to post yourself up on. So you want to be, it's easier to do this in the prone position, and you're resting it on some kind of like a backpack or some kind of solid, kind of a soft surface really, just to kind of stabilize it. And you want to flip to your, let me flip that there, to the long range aperture right here. So on the A1, this is a GNP, let me show you real quick. This is a GNP car 15 right here. And on the this really uses the A1 model. This is probably one of the most realistic ones out there, actually, in terms of the sight aperture. But as you'll notice right there, it has the letter L on it, and that indicates the long range aperture. Now, I know some folks have debated whether the aperture sizes are supposed to be the same or not, and in this case it's not, but I don't know if that's historically accurate or not. But anyway, that's the long range aperture, and that's the sight that you're going to use for now to zero this gun at 25 feet, or 20 feet, let's just say that. And what you'll do is you look down this sight to line up with the front sight post. Oh, I forgot to mention, before we all do that, we need to make sure that the sights are flushed with the surface. So what that means is that if this thing is kind of pressed all the way, rotated all the way down, you want to rotate it back up just so that the surface of this, the front sight post is flush with the surface of this, the actual surface of this part right here. And once you do that, and you flip to the long range sight, you just pick a target at set up a target at 20 feet and fire 3 rounds from this stable position. Okay, and if the rounds are too low, okay, what you want to do is, which they probably will be, what you want to do is you want to press down that detent and rotate the sight post clockwise. Okay, and again, that means the sight post will go down, and when it goes down, you're naturally going to aim upwards a little bit, and that's going to cause the round to shift upwards, to the point of impact to shift up. So you do that, and each time you rotate that, you just rotate that by a couple clicks. And when I say click, that basically means like a single, basically a rotation, basically. Same thing with the rear. If you notice your rounds, and that basically, that front sight post basically adjusts the elevation, whether it's too high or too low. That's what you would use. The rear sight post right here, you only adjust for windage, which is left and right. So if your rounds are falling too close to the left or too close to the right, you can always just dial it the way you want it, just to land it where you're at. And again, once you have that accomplished, right, and you zeroed at 20 feet, depends on the gun again, but if you were to do it on a Marui, it happens to be at that range, you'll be zero at 75 feet. Now, I don't have a range that's far, that's really that far, and I wanted to be able to test this out further on down the road, but that's kind of what you're looking at right there. Alrighty, so if you were to do this on a WE, it's a little bit different. I mean, it's the same concept. Again, this is originally an XM177, but the front sight post is still the same. It has the same thing right there. In this case, you can use the tool that it comes with it, and again, flush the sights. We're using this as the adjustment tool. And then the rear sight's a little bit different. They kind of went the lazy route, even though it has the traditional A1 style rear sight here. The apertures are actually the A2 style aperture. So if you can see there, it has the little 0 to 2 right there. Now I always thought that was kind of like a parts catalog number. Like, oh, you know, the 0 to 2 is going to be your sight if you broke it or anything like that, and you're going to get, if you break it, you get a new piece. That's not the case. That actually 0 to 2 refers to, that I was told, actually refers to the distance in which you use it. So it's referring to 0 to 200 meters is that's what the sight is designed for. So in this case, if you're trying to zero it at that 25 or to 20 feet, like we were talking about, you would flip it to the that aperture right there. That would be equivalent to your long range aperture, or in this case, it's marked with an L. So the A1 is supposed to have the L and not look like the O2. The O2 is really found. This thing is really supposed to be found on the newer versions, like the M16 A2s. So anyway. But anyway, if you were to do it, you would flip it down to the long range aperture, the little peep sight right there, do the same thing, and you would be zeroed at 25, and that would, or 20 to 25, and that would zero you for about 75 when you fire. Now, if you were to do it on a newer system, such as this right here, this is the A2 system would be similar to something like this. Notice how the front sight post is still the same, okay? But the rear sight's a little bit different because now you have both windage, again, that's left and right adjustments, and you've got elevation. And we'll talk about that in a little bit right now. But so to do this, to zero it for this system, what you would do is you would still do the same thing with the front sight post, flush that to make sure it's lined up, and then set it to basically flip it from the O2 aperture back there to the distance, the peep sight right there, the small peep sight right there. And this comes with all these little, I don't know if you can see that, but it comes with all these little grids or these little hash marks right there on the side. And you want to make sure you line up that point right there to make sure that that point lines up with these lines right here. And make sure it's in the center. And then as you fire, if you need to make fine-tune left and right adjustments, you would use this, again, turning right to turn the point of impact to the right, turning it back counterclockwise to move it to the left. And then, but before you do that, you want to make sure, I forgot to mention, you want to make sure that this wheel is turned all the way down. So it can always go up, right? But you want to make sure that the elevation is adjusted all the way down to the bottom. And that's kind of a basic level of what happens there. Okay, and then that's the A2 system there. So I know that was a little bit lengthy. So we're going to talk about now kind of the ballistics trend of these guns, and we're about to get into the nitty gritty of it, and we're just gonna go wrap more quickly after this. But if you notice here, you might be asking an obvious question, and that's if you've got your sights zeroed at 20 or 25 feet right here, and you're aiming at 75 feet, good for you. You can hit where you're aiming at, right? But what happens if you zeroed it here and you had a target that was, say, I don't know, at 30 feet right here, right? Does that mean you're going to hit the target high? Yes, absolutely. Because remember, your line of sight is still right there, and you're aiming here, but the round is actually in this right, and you'll be able to notice that. So the way to account for this is very interesting. In the real world, and just like in the airsoft world, they're both the same. So back to the A1 model, this is, you'll notice that even though I don't have any elevation, there's no wheel back here, there is a way to adjust for that. So what happens is this is on the long range aperture. So what you want to do is you want to flip it back down to the short range aperture, which is basically the larger of the peep sights right there, right? That's the larger one. And what happens is that will basically account for it will drop you a couple of clicks, essentially. Those sights will drop you. So when you're aiming that's why it's so important you zero with the long range sight, because that's how it follows this path right here. But if you were to flip sights, you drop a couple of inches. And so that means if you were to aim at a target right here at 30 feet again, your rounds would compensate, and it would actually start landing closer to more like this range right here, and then it would land out here. Of course, that means you might still need to adjust a little bit, but that's kind of the whole point of that. So on an A2 system, that's the exact same thing, right? You still flip it to the O2 aperture. For 0 to 200, that's kind of what they're referring to. Because you're originally setting it for 300 feet. But again, if you're going to shoot at a target that's 200 or less feet away, you're going to be shooting high. And to compensate for that, you switch to that O2 aperture to hit that target. So I guess you're probably wondering at this point, well, what does this all look like on paper? What do all these profiles look like? So we'll go over that. So before we get into the different AR-15 ballistics, I forgot to mention that once you zeroed your rifle at 25 feet using the long range aperture, you do not need to make any more changes in elevation with your front sight post. That's the settings that you want to keep As long as at 25 feet, you've noticed that your line of sight is where your rounds are hitting, that means it's good. From then on, for the A1 system, if you need to make modifications in elevation, you kind of just flip the rear sight back and forth a little bit for those short range rounds. But for longer shots, longer than 75 feet, you kind of just have to adjust your rifle by kind of pointing it upwards a little bit. There's no real modification. For the A2, there's actually an adjustment system in the back where you can actually raise that dial by turning it to adjust for and compensate for shots beyond 75 feet, or if whatever the range might be, and then you can actually dial in the sights in their back that way. Okay, so finally, this is it. Now that we've talked about how the different iron sights are set up and how you zero them initially, you're ready to go. So let's start off by keeping we're going to go through each of these rifles here. And so before we start, we're going to keep in mind that right now we're going to leave it in the long range aperture and talk about that. So the first one we're going to talk about is the Marui. If we're going to leave it in that long range aperture, remember it's the very small, the one with the small pinhole in the peep sight. That one, I've zeroed it at 20 feet, basically. So you'll notice in the blue line, that's the actual rounds that I've collected. The orange line is just like the trend line that shows, like, it makes it easier to kind of see, like a trend line. But the blue is actually the real data points. So at 20 feet, you'll notice that it's zeroed. Again, so remember that picture at the very beginning of the user manual where the guy is like aiming and like the point of impact meeting the line of sight? And hitting the target exactly, that's 20 feet for the Marui. So that means that shift in impact is 0. So it's where you're looking is where you're hitting. If you were to present a target closer than 20 feet, so let's say you're shooting someone at 15 feet, right? Your rounds are going to fall low, even though you're looking at 0, that's where you're looking at, but your rounds are going to land at around like half an inch low. The closer you get to the wall, right, or the target, right, the more you're going to drop off. So basically, this is that point blank right here. So obviously you're looking at the target, but because the barrel is like 2.5 inches below, you're going to hit low. So anyway, that's kind of an illustration here. So what happens when you go beyond 20 feet, right? And again, keep in mind it's still the long range aperture we're using. If you're aiming beyond 20 feet, notice how it starts rising, right? Because the barrel is slanted, it's curved, but it's also going up quite a bit. So after a couple of shots, you notice like it peaks out around like 30 feet. So at 30 feet, it kind of comes up to almost around there's margins of error, but it's about 3.5 inches, sometimes 4 inches above where you're aiming. So you're looking really right here because that's where you're aiming. But the shift in impact, right, is shifted up by almost 4 inches, 3.5 inches basically, because that's where you've zeroed it. So if you were aiming at the tip of like a small target, you would miss it by quite a bit. So that's keeping the long range impact in there. And don't worry, we'll find a way to fix this. But then, of course, it kind of levels out afterwards, and I didn't have anything further than 40 feet to test this. But so that's kind of like it probably starts coasting around 3 inches, and remember it's going to start dropping and dropping and dropping, and it probably is going to drop back to that line of sight again to be parallel with the 0 at around like 75 feet, and then. That's why when we're zeroed at 20, you're good at 75, theoretically speaking. If you need to shoot further, of course, like I said, you can dial the rear elevation up, and that would basically cause your gun to point upward a little bit, and you would shoot rounds further downrange. So let's talk about if we were to flip to the short range aperture real quick. This is what it would look like here. Again, trend line is the orange, the blue line is the actual recordings. And don't be fooled because the margins or the scale is a little bit different when the impact. So these are kind of notice how before it was much larger. But anyway, this is the same trend. Again, it starts out below. But what you'll notice here is that the line of sight where the rounds meet where the line of sight is, it's a little bit further out. So it's at roughly after 25 feet. It's no longer at 20 feet. But what you'll notice is that these shots are not going as high. And this is significant because remember what we talked about, that problem where, if you're you zeroed your sight at 20, and you're also going to hit someone at 75 feet, right where you're looking. The problem is what happens if you're shooting someone around 30 feet, right? That's kind of a problem. So if you're playing airsoft in the field, if you hit someone 30 feet, you're gonna, maybe it's just like the head is sticking out or something like that, right? You're gonna miss them completely. And so to account for that or compensate, you can either just aim a little bit lower, knowing that your target's 30 feet away, or if you have time, you can just flip to your short range aperture, and you'll notice that the rise is only by an inch, right? So and that's what we're talking about. The short range aperture basically always shoots a little bit lower than the long range aperture. It's always like a couple degree or a couple clicks lower, and that's the whole point. So that when you're in that intermediate range, where you're going to be shooting too high because of the general ballistics of it, you're going to naturally aim lower because the short range aperture accounts for that. So notice at 30 feet, you're still a little bit high, but about an inch though, but that's much better than being about 3.5 inches off right there. So what this basically means is that if you're the short range aperture is excellent for anything that's less than 50 feet or less, basically, because it corrects for that over the top ballistics profile. Now you might be asking, well, what about if it's less than 20 feet or less? Should I just keep it at the long range aperture? Because look how at 20 feet, you're looking through that long range aperture. Where you're looking is where it's hitting. And if you were to use a short range aperture, you would go low. And the answer is you could, but it's probably not a good idea. Keep in mind that long range aperture, is just very small, so it's harder to get a quick sight picture. You want to use that the small range aperture. You want to, sorry about that. You want to keep your small range aperture available so that you can just get quicker sight pictures. Again, I don't think this really matters at short range, whether it's 1 inch or, so below. That's another reason too. So that's why you keep it on the short range the entire time, all the way up into 50. And after 50, you switch it to the long range aperture because that's what you've zeroed your sights to land at, around 75 feet. Now, if you use the the short range aperture to hit targets out to 75 feet, remember, you'll be shooting low, and then you probably will miss that because, again, the short range generally has a lower ballistics profile. So that's probably the most useful tool here. Again, is an inch or so going to be a big deal? Probably not, but, if further out, if it's a smaller target, maybe that would help you. I don't know, maybe you can win some games this way. But that's just the ballistic profile of the Marui right there, and so that's kind of a cool thing to show. Next up, this is the G&P Car 15 here. Now this is a fairly new one. I just got this. This is actually a 10.5 inch barrel, but it doesn't really. It seems to have a different profile, and I don't think it's just because of the barrel. It's just the different setup that's causing it. But this one has again, the same thing, the long range aperture. You'll notice a similar trend. But in general, it just fires a lot lower, much more frequently, and to the point where even it doesn't seem to cross the line of sight. The rounds don't even seem to cross the line of sight until almost about 35 feet. I know the trend line says 30 feet, but in reality, it's about 35 feet. So it's quite a bit of ways, and I don't know why. It's just that's the way the setup is like. Maybe the hop up has something to do with it, but nevertheless, it still has the same issue or the same pattern as most of the other ARs. Now, because it doesn't cross the line of sight until all the way to about 35 feet, I don't have that. Don't know whether it's going to start leveling out or what the peak height of it is beyond 38 or 40 feet. I wish I had a longer range, and I'll find out one day. But as far as I can tell right now, I can't really tell how it peaks out at. If I were to flip to the short range, a little bit messy, but again, similar trend right there. And it's probably better to see it combined together like this. A little messy in general, but as the pattern still holds true, again, the short range aperture is lower hitting. than the long range, and that's why you use it again for those intermediate distances. Kind of take this with what you will, but it seems like you need to kind of adjust it a little bit differently. But anyway, that's just for the Car 15. I just got this, and but I think the same principles would apply, though. You would still want to use the short range aperture for those less than 40 or less than 50 feet shots that you're taking, just to account for this. Because likely this, given that trend we saw the Marui, this long range aperture will probably result in overshooting your target at that 40 feet probably, or 50 feet, or probably. I don't know, but we'll see. Next up, I got the, well, this is really the XM177. At this point, it was running the really like 10.5-inch barrel right there. But the problem was this kind of, the crush washer connecting the barrel to the trunnion of the rifle was a little bit loose. It was using an O-ring that was kind of dented. So it kind of was a little bit wobbly. And so it kind of had some wobble issues. So the first time I did it, I mapped the points. I didn't get any real trends. And I ran it through the Excel data analysis. And I could not find any trends, whether for the long range or the short range. The only difference, of course, the only thing I could conclude was that, again, the short range was still consistently lower hitting than the long range. But in terms of like upward trajectory, in terms of distance, bad luck there. But that's mainly because there was barrel wobble. So once I corrected that, in this configuration, this is the M733 configuration. Notice how it's got that like 11.5-inch barrel right there. But the biggest thing, and that doesn't really matter that much, what really matters is that I corrected the barrel wobble right there with a new crush washer installed right there to fix that. And after that, I did that, that resulted in a fix that really gave us a better like a trend, again, that's just like before. A little wobbly, a little snake-like right there, but nevertheless still a trend. And you'll notice that it kind of crosses the line, the rounds cross the line of sight around, similar around to the Marui, around that 20 feet roughly, 15, 20 feet roughly, or sorry, 19, 20 feet. Again, long range aperture, it'll hit there, but then again, it continues to increase if you were to go further out. I don't know why there was a dip here for some reason. That was kind of odd. Could have just been me, but again, with the short range, it looks like this. But again, of course, again, most important when you put them together. And you'll notice the trend again. It seems that there's something going on right here. I don't know what happened there. It might have been a bad issue right there. But as you can see here, if you were take hits or take shots at 35 feet or 40 feet roughly, you're going to be a little bit high. So to account for that, you might want to flip to your short range. In this case, it kind of went below that line of sight a little bit, just a tad bit. But again, to be just half an inch low at 40 feet or 38 feet is much better than being 2 inches high at 38 feet. So the principles still apply. We're kind of beating a dead horse at this point, where we're saying short range. But I really want to illustrate the point that it's consistent among all the system for the most part. If we kind of exclude some of the anomalous trends that we saw, or I think that's the wrong word I used. Whatever, you know what I mean. But the anomalies, yeah, that's the word I'm looking for. So again, that's really it. You really want to be using short ranges, 50 and under, the short range aperture. Anything more than that, long, you want to use the long range aperture. Of course, that's different though when you're zeroing your sights, remember. So when you're zeroing your sights, you use the long range aperture, even though you're at 20 or 25 feet. But after that, when you're actually using it in a field or in a game like that, that's how you want to use it. Boy, that was super long, but I hope that you folks found that super helpful and kind of interesting, and maybe test that out with your gas blowback ARs. Alright folks, see y'all next time.